Years ago, I stumbled upon her betrayal. I was looking for a phone charger in her work bag when I found the second phone. Messages between her and someone labeled J. Explicit, smug, and dripping with contempt. "He's so boring," she had written. "I don't even think he'd notice if I moved out tomorrow. He's so busy being the perfect husband." I sat there for hours reading, my mind going numb with every new message. My wife, the woman I'd spent a decade loving and building a life with, had been cheating on me with a coworker. Her boss, no less. When she got home that evening, I said nothing. I cooked dinner, watched her laugh at some stupid sitcom, and kissed her goodnight. And then I started planning. For the next 4 years, I became a ghost in my own marriage. I played the role of the oblivious husband perfectly, all while gathering evidence. I installed spyware on her phone, cameras in the house, and even bugged her car. The more I uncovered, the more ruthless I became in my resolve. It wasn't just the affair. Her whole life was a web of lies. She mocked me to her friends, lied about her upbringing to seem more interesting, and even admitted she'd married me because she thought I'd make her life comfortable. But I knew I couldn't just leave. She'd made it clear to her friends that if I found out, she'd clean me out in the divorce and start fresh. So I bided my time. I let her believe I was the fool she always thought I was. The shocking news came on a Tuesday. That was the day everything changed. It was a gray Tuesday morning when everything fell into place. I was at work, staring blankly at my computer screen, when a notification from one of my spyware programs pinged on my phone. It was a conversation between my wife and Jay. He'd sent her a string of frantic messages, begging her to meet. "We need to talk," he wrote. "I don't think we can keep doing this. My wife is suspicious. I'm not losing my career for you." I smirked. So, the golden boy was crumbling. It wasn't just his wife catching on. My meticulous digging had ensured he was starting to feel the walls close in. But that wasn't the shocking part. What came next hit me like a freight train. "Don't be dramatic," my wife replied. "It's not like you'll be tied to me forever. I've got my escape plan. Once his parents' estate goes through, I'll divorce him. I'll be set for life, and you won't have to worry about me anymore." I froze. My parents' estate? My parents had passed away the previous year, and their sizable inheritance was being held in probate. She'd never mentioned it once. I thought she'd been supportive during my grief, comforting me as I dealt with the loss. In reality, she'd been biding her time, salivating over the thought of cashing out. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the phone. My blood boiled as the pieces clicked together. Every "I'm so sorry for your loss," every tear she'd shed at the funeral, every late-night hug, all of it had been a charade. This wasn't just an affair. This was a calculated attempt to gut me financially and emotionally, to play the long con until she could walk away unscathed. Something inside me shifted that day. I'd always thought of revenge as petty, beneath me. But this wasn't revenge anymore. It was justice. That night, I came home to find her lounging on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She barely looked up when I walked in. "Hey," she said flatly, as if she were doing me a favor by acknowledging my presence. "Hey," I replied, just as flat, masking the storm inside me. I'd gotten good at that, being the man she thought was oblivious, harmless. Tonight, though, I felt electric. I kissed her on the cheek and headed to the kitchen to prepare dinner. As I chopped vegetables, she started rambling about some promotion Jay was up for. "He's working so hard," she said. "It's just unfair how much pressure they put on him." I clenched the knife handle tighter. She didn't even bother hiding her admiration anymore. "Sounds rough," I said, voice steady. The dinner conversation was the usual charade. She talked about work, the gym, the girls' night she had planned for the weekend. Lies, all of it. But I smiled and nodded, even offering to drive her to her friend's house. She didn't know I'd already mapped out her weekend rendezvous with Jay. After dinner, I excused myself to the study, claiming I had some work to finish. Really, I was finalizing my preparations. Over the years, I'd gathered an arsenal of evidence, texts, videos, photos, but tonight was about more than that. Tonight, I was setting the bait. I composed an email from an anonymous account to Jay's wife, attaching enough damning evidence to rock her world but leaving out the juiciest parts. I wanted her angry, but not so furious that she'd confront him before the weekend. Timing was everything. Next, I created a burner phone account and sent my wife a cryptic text. I know what you're planning. I know everything. I hit send and waited. She walked into the study minutes later, her face pale, phone clutched in her hand. Did you send me this? She demanded, holding the phone out. I glanced up from my laptop, feigning confusion. What? No. What's going on? She hesitated, her eyes narrowing as she tried to gauge my sincerity. It's nothing. Just spam. Spam? I raised an eyebrow. Seemed to upset you. She forced a laugh, brushing it off. It's nothing, really. Forget it. But as she left the room, I noticed her grip on the phone tighten, her shoulders tense. The seed of doubt had been planted. For the next 2 days, I watched her unravel. She was on edge, snapping at me over trivial things and constantly checking her phone. Meanwhile, I reached out to a lawyer, ensuring every financial safeguard was in place to protect myself once the storm hit. The weekend came faster than I expected. She kissed me goodbye Friday evening, promising she wouldn't be out too late. I smiled, wished her fun, and watched her drive away. Little did she know, I'd already installed a GPS tracker on her car. I followed her car that night, maintaining just enough distance to stay out of sight. The GPS tracker made it easy. She drove across town to the one place I already knew she'd be, a boutique hotel she and Jay had been using for months. I parked a block away and watched as she exited her car. She was dressed to kill. Heels, a tight black dress that I hadn't seen her wear in years, and a glint of excitement in her eyes. She walked into the hotel lobby, glancing over her shoulder once, as if she sensed something. I stayed in the car for a moment, steadying my breathing. My pulse was pounding, not with nerves, but with a cold, calculated fury. Tonight wasn't just about her and Jay. Tonight was about setting the dominoes in motion. Once she was inside, I grabbed my duffel bag from the back seat and headed to the hotel side entrance, a camera-free access point I'd scouted earlier. I'd booked a room on the same floor as hers under a fake name, using cash. By now, I had her room number from the tracker on her phone. Room 312. I waited in my room for 30 minutes before moving. I didn't need to knock on their door or barge in. This wasn't a cheap soap opera. Instead, I set up the equipment I'd brought, a small, discreet wireless camera that I slid under their doorframe and a receiver to monitor their conversation. At first, it was all laughter and flirtation. I listened as Jay tried to assure her that his wife wasn't onto them. She's dumb as a rock, he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. You're overthinking. She's not as dumb as you think, my wife shot back, almost annoyed. And neither is he. Your husband? Jay laughed. Please. He's too whipped to notice. You've been screwing me for years, and he still hasn't caught on. The guy's pathetic. I clenched my fists but forced myself to remain still. Let them talk. Let them dig their graves. Then she said it, the one line that sealed her fate. Well, it doesn't matter. Once the estate money comes through, I'll be gone. He can cry into his millions for all I care. I clicked off the receiver, my decision made. Back in my room, I uploaded the video to the cloud, ensuring it couldn't be erased. I sent a clip to Jay's wife, just enough to guarantee she'd confront him publicly. Then, I left the hotel, leaving the rest of the night to play out on its own. By the time I returned home, I'd set the final stage of my plan into motion. The world my wife thought she controlled was about to collapse, and all she would see was the hand she thought was too weak to fight back. The next morning, I sat in the kitchen sipping my coffee, waiting for her to stumble through the door. It wasn't long before I heard the telltale sound of her heels clicking against the tile floor. She entered, her hair slightly disheveled, her makeup smudged. She looked like she hadn't slept a wink. Late night? I asked casually, not bothering to look up from my mug. She froze for a second, then forced a smile. Yeah, it was fun. Just the girls and I catching up. I hummed in response, not pressing her further. Let her think she'd pulled it off again. The calm didn't last long. By mid-afternoon, her phone began vibrating nonstop. I timed my next move perfectly. Jay's wife had received the footage by now, and I knew her well enough from my research to predict her reaction. She was fiery and impulsive, the type who wouldn't hesitate to confront him in the most public way possible. It didn't take long for news to spread. By evening, my wife's phone calls to Jay were going straight to voicemail. Her demeanor shifted, panic starting to creep into her voice as she muttered under her breath and furiously texted someone. "What's wrong?" I asked, playing the concerned husband. "Nothing," she snapped, then softened her tone. "Work stuff. You know how it is." I smirked internally. She had no idea that her entire web of lies was already starting to unravel. That night, I excused myself to the garage, claiming I had some things to organize. In reality, I was on the phone with my lawyer. I'd already initiated the divorce process, but this was about more than leaving her. It was about obliterating her. I made sure my lawyer knew to emphasize the infidelity, the fraud, and her intentions to siphon off my inheritance. The evidence I had would guarantee her not only a pathetic settlement, but possibly legal consequences as well. By the time I came back inside, she was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at her phone. She looked up at me, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. "Everything okay?" I asked, tilting my head. She hesitated, then nodded. "Of course. Why wouldn't it be?" I shrugged and went upstairs, leaving her to stew in her paranoia. That night, I sent an anonymous email to her workplace, attaching evidence of her affair with her boss. The company had strict policies against fraternization, especially between supervisors and employees. I knew it would only be a matter of time before HR got involved. By the end of the week, her perfect little life would be in shambles. And that was only the beginning. The unraveling began faster than I expected. By Tuesday morning, my wife's workplace was in full crisis mode. She'd left the house early, dressed impeccably as always, determined to maintain the image of a dedicated professional. I almost felt a pang of admiration for her composure. Almost. By noon, I received the first sign that the bomb I'd planted had detonated. She called me, her voice trembling but trying to sound steady. "Hey, I might be home late tonight. Something came up at work," she said. "Oh," I replied, feigning concern. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," she said too quickly. "Just some issues to sort out. Nothing to worry about." I smiled, knowing full well that issues meant HR had received my anonymous email. I'd been thorough, providing timestamps, screenshots of explicit messages, and even a video snippet of her and Jay leaving the hotel together. No wiggle room. When she finally came home that night, she was a mess. Her blazer was wrinkled, her makeup smeared from what I assumed were tears hastily wiped away. She didn't say a word, just walked past me and went straight to the bedroom. I waited until the next morning before asking, "You seemed upset last night. Is something going on?" She glared at me, her temper flaring for the first time in days. "I told you, it's work stuff. Just drop it, okay?" I nodded, as though I was letting it go. In reality, I already knew her world was crumbling. Jay had been suspended pending an investigation, and my wife wasn't far behind. A source I'd paid off in HR told me she'd been called in for a second meeting the following day. But that wasn't the only storm brewing. Jay's wife had gone nuclear. By Wednesday, she'd posted a public takedown of Jay and my wife on every social media platform imaginable, tagged photos of them together, screenshots of their texts, even the hotel receipt, which she'd apparently ripped from Jay's briefcase before confronting him. The fallout was instant. Friends and family began commenting, sharing, and gossiping. By Thursday evening, the post had gone semi-viral within our local community. Mutual friends were messaging me, offering their support, while clearly fishing for details. When my wife saw the post, I could practically feel the walls of the house shake with her rage. She threw her phone across the room, the sound of it shattering against the wall echoing through the house. "Can you believe this psycho?" she yelled at me, pacing the living room. "She's trying to ruin my life." I folded my arms, leaning against the doorway. "Well, you did sleep with her husband," I said calmly. She froze, her eyes locking on mine. What are you talking about?" I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "I know everything. The affair, the hotel, your little plan to cash out and leave me once my parents' estate cleared. All of it." Her face went pale. You don't know what you're talking about, she stammered, but the tremble in her voice betrayed her. Oh, I do. And so does everyone else now, thanks to Jay's wife. She sank into the couch, her bravado finally crumbling. You don't understand. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I was going to tell you. Save it, I snapped, cutting her off. You don't get to play the victim. Not this time. The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time, I saw her for who she truly was, small, desperate, and terrified. And I wasn't done yet. By Friday, the cracks in her life had become irreparable. Her job was gone. The HR investigation concluded faster than I'd anticipated, and she was terminated for violating professional conduct. Jay was fired too, which only added fuel to the fire. His wife, furious and vindictive, had filed for divorce and began spreading stories about him across town, ensuring his name was tarnished beyond repair. My wife's humiliation was becoming public. The whispers, the judgmental looks, it was everything she feared, and I savored every second of it. But I wasn't finished. That evening, as she sat on the couch scrolling through job listings with a glass of wine clutched in one trembling hand, I made my move. I think it's time we had a talk, I said, standing in the doorway. She glanced up, her expression already defensive. What now? I walked into the room and tossed a thick manila envelope onto the coffee table. It landed with a loud slap, and she jumped slightly. What's this? She asked, narrowing her eyes. Divorce papers, I said simply. Her face twisted into a mixture of shock and fury. You're joking, she said, her voice low and dangerous. I'm not, I replied, sitting down across from her. And before you start screaming about taking half of everything, I'd suggest reading the section about infidelity clauses. She grabbed the envelope and began flipping through the pages, her eyes widening as she realized what I'd done. The prenup we'd signed before our marriage, a document she had smugly dismissed as unnecessary at the time, had an ironclad clause about adultery. You're bluffing, she hissed. This won't hold up in court. Oh, it will, I said, leaning back in my chair. I have evidence. Texts, photos, videos. Enough to make any judge laugh you out of the courtroom. And if you want to fight it, I'll make sure every sordid detail gets dragged into the light. She looked at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. For once, she had no snarky comeback, no cruel remark to throw my way. You can't do this, she finally whispered. I already have, I replied. By the way, I've already had the house appraised and listed. You'll need to find somewhere else to stay. She shot to her feet, her wine glass clattering to the floor. You can't just kick me out. Actually, I can, I said, my voice cold and even. This house was purchased with money from my parents' inheritance. It's in my name, not ours. And as of next week, it's no longer yours. Her fury boiled over then. She screamed, hurled insults at me, accused me of being heartless. But it didn't matter. Her words had no power anymore. Before she could storm out of the room, I hit her with the final blow. Oh, and one more thing, I said, pulling out my phone. I've already sent copies of everything to immigration. She froze mid-step, turning to face me. What? You remember how you bragged about using me for citizenship? Turns out, lying on a spousal visa application is a serious offense. They're reviewing your case now. Her face drained of all color. You didn't. I did. She stood there, trembling, as the weight of it all finally sank in. Everything she'd schemed for, everything she'd built her lies around, was gone. I hate you, she spat, her voice cracking. No, I said, standing and walking past her. You hate that I played the game better than you did. The days that followed were almost too quiet. She stayed locked in the guest room, barely emerging except to glare at me or grab a drink. I gave her the space. She wasn't my problem anymore. But her downfall wasn't limited to our house. The news of her affair, her lies, and her sudden job termination had spread through our circle like wildfire. Friends we once shared began cutting her off, one by one. Even her closest allies, the ones she confided in during the affair, turned on her, desperate to distance themselves from the wreckage. She received a letter from immigration a few days later. I knew when it arrived because she screamed. A guttural, animalistic sound that echoed through the house. She stormed into the living room, waving the letter in her hand. "You're ruining my life," she yelled, her face red with fury. I didn't even look up from the book I was reading. "No," I said calmly. "You ruined your own life. I'm just making sure the consequences catch up to you." She tore the letter in half and threw it at me. "You're a monster. And you're a liar, a cheater, and a user," I shot back, finally looking at her. "But unlike you, I'm honest about who I am." The letter had informed her that her immigration case was under review and that she'd need to attend a formal hearing. The evidence I'd submitted, combined with her now pending divorce, painted a clear picture. She'd lied on her spousal visa application. A deportation order was practically guaranteed. Over the next week, I watched her unravel completely. She tried calling Jay, but he wasn't answering. His wife had locked him out of their accounts, frozen his credit cards, and filed for divorce. He was drowning in his own mess and couldn't be bothered to save her. She spent hours on the phone, begging for help from friends, family, anyone who would listen. But her story had already made the rounds. Nobody wanted to be associated with her anymore. One night, I heard her sobbing in the guest room. For a moment, I almost felt a flicker of pity. But then I remembered every cruel word she'd said about me to Jay. Every mocking laugh, every scheme she concocted to use me and discard me. The pity vanished. The next morning, I handed her an envelope. "What's this now?" she asked bitterly, barely glancing at it. "It's your timeline," I said. "You have 1 week to pack your things and leave. The house closes in 2 weeks, and I won't be here when it does." She opened the envelope and scanned the contents, details about the sale, the divorce proceedings, and the immigration hearing. Her face crumpled as she realized there was no way out. "Where am I supposed to go?" she asked, her voice breaking. "That's not my concern," I said. "You should have thought of that before you decided to betray me." For the first time, she didn't yell. She didn't fight back. She just stared at the papers in her hands, defeated. And as I walked away, I felt nothing but satisfaction. The day she left was anticlimactic, considering the storm that had led up to it. She packed her belongings with a quiet resignation I'd never seen in her before. No yelling, no slamming doors, no desperate pleas for me to change my mind. She didn't even bother with her usual barbs. I guess she knew there was nothing left to say. I watched from the doorway as she loaded the last of her suitcases into the trunk of her car. She hesitated for a moment, her hand resting on the door handle, then turned to face me. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" she asked, her voice hollow. "No," I said honestly. "What I wanted was a marriage built on love and trust. But you made that impossible." She didn't respond, just nodded like she'd expected that answer. Without another word, she got into her car and drove away. I stood there until the sound of her engine faded into the distance. The silence in the house was deafening at first. For years, it had been filled with her voice, her presence, even her lies. Now it was just me, alone with the ghosts of what could have been. But that silence? It didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like freedom. Over the next few weeks, I finalized the sale of the house and moved into a new apartment, a sleek, modern space overlooking the city skyline. It was smaller, quieter, and completely mine. No traces of her, no memories of the life we'd built on a foundation of deception. I kept busy with work, the gym, and reconnecting with friends I drifted away from during my marriage. For the first time in years, I felt like myself again. Not the ghost of a man trying to please someone who never truly valued me. As for her, the fallout continued long after she left. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd been formally charged with visa fraud and faced deportation. Her attempts to fight it had failed miserably. The evidence was overwhelming. Jay's wife had done her part to make sure the world knew who my ex-wife was. She'd plastered social media with updates, screenshots, and even a gleeful post when the deportation order was finalized. "Karma always wins," she'd written, and I couldn't agree more. One day, I received an email from my lawyer confirming the divorce was finalized. I stared at the notification for a long time, letting it sink in. It was official. I was free. I didn't celebrate, didn't feel the need to. The victory wasn't in her downfall. It was in reclaiming my life. In the weeks that followed the divorce, I began to understand the magnitude of what I'd been through. The betrayal, the years of being used. It could have broken me. But instead, it made me sharper, stronger, more aware of who I was and what I wanted from life. Therapy became a part of my routine. I'd never considered it before, dismissing the idea as unnecessary, but unpacking everything with a professional changed me in ways I hadn't expected. The anger, the guilt for not seeing the signs sooner, the part of me that questioned if I'd done enough to save the marriage. It all started to fade as I worked through it. One afternoon, during a session, my therapist asked me, "What do you want your life to look like now?" I sat there for a moment, caught off guard by the simplicity of the question. For years, my life had revolved around reacting to her moods, her lies, her needs. I'd never stopped to think about what I wanted. "I want peace," I said finally, and so I set out to create exactly that. The new apartment became my sanctuary. I decorated it in a way that reflected me, modern but warm, with pieces that held meaning rather than memories of someone else. I adopted a dog from a local shelter, a scrappy little terrier mix who seemed just as eager for a fresh start as I was. I named him Ace. My friendships, too, began to heal. I reached out to people I'd lost touch with, explaining why I disappeared and taking responsibility for the distance I'd allowed to grow. To my surprise, most of them welcomed me back with open arms. Work became a source of pride again. I poured myself into projects, climbed the ladder, and earned a promotion I'd been chasing for years. My colleagues started noticing the change in me, the confidence, the ease with which I carried myself now. But the most unexpected part of rebuilding was the sense of gratitude I found. Gratitude for the people who'd stood by me, for the lessons I'd learned, even for the betrayal that had set me on this path. One night, I came across an old photo of us, me and her, smiling at some party years ago. For a moment, I felt the familiar sting of what could have been. But then I realized that the man in that photo wasn't me anymore. I took the photo and slid it into the trash, a quiet but final gesture of closure. By the end of that year, I'd built a life I was proud of. Not because it was perfect or flashy, but because it was mine. A life free from lies, manipulation, and the suffocating weight of someone else's agenda. Months turned into a year, and life began to feel steady, even happy. The scars from my marriage were still there, of course, but they no longer felt like wounds. They were just reminders, proof that I'd survived, that I was stronger than I'd ever thought. I told myself I wasn't looking for love. After all, I'd just rebuilt my life, brick by brick, and the idea of letting someone else in seemed risky. But life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. Her name was Claire. We met at the dog park, of all places. Ace had taken off after a tennis ball that wasn't his, and it landed at her feet. She laughed as she handed it back, her auburn hair catching the late afternoon sun. "He's determined, isn't he?" she said, smiling. I nodded, a little taken aback. It had been so long since I'd felt the warmth of a genuine smile directed at me. "Yeah, he doesn't quit. Sorry about that. He's still learning boundaries." "Sounds like most of us," she replied with a shrug, and just like that, we started talking. At first, it was casual, a conversation here, a laugh there whenever we bumped into each other at the park. But over time, it became something more. Coffee dates turned into dinners, and dinners turned into long walks where we talked about everything. Our lives, our fears, our dreams. I told her about my past eventually. I didn't want to hide it, didn't want to pretend I was someone I wasn't. She listened quietly as I recounted the betrayal, the divorce, the mess I'd been left to clean up. When I finished, I braced myself for judgment, for pity. Instead, she reached out and took my hand. "You're not defined by what she did to you," she said softly. "You're defined by how you moved on." Something in me shifted that night. For years, I'd been carrying the weight of my ex's actions, letting them dictate how I saw myself. But Claire's words were like a key, unlocking a door I hadn't realized I'd kept closed. I didn't rush into anything with Claire. We took our time, getting to know each other, building something real. And for the first time in years, I felt what it was like to be with someone who valued me. Not for what I could give her, not for what she could take from me, but simply for who I was. It wasn't perfect, of course. I had moments where the shadows of my past crept in, where trust felt like a fragile thing. But Claire never pushed, never pressured. She let me heal at my own pace, and in doing so, she became a part of that healing. One evening, as we sat on my apartment balcony watching the city lights, she turned to me and asked, "Do you believe in second chances?" I thought about it for a moment, then nodded. "I do, but not for everyone." She smiled at that, leaning her head on my shoulder. "Good. Because sometimes, life after the storm is better than anything you could have imagined." And for the first time in a long time, I believed her. Life with Claire felt effortless in a way I hadn't thought possible. There was no walking on eggshells, no second-guessing every word or action. It was the kind of relationship that made me realize just how toxic my marriage had been. But while I was moving forward, my ex-wife's shadow still lingered in the background. Occasionally, I'd hear bits and pieces about her through mutual acquaintances or by accident. Her deportation had gone through, and she was now living back in her home country. No job, no safety net, and no Jay to cling to. He'd left her to fend for herself once the chaos of his own divorce had settled. One day, I got an email from her. I almost deleted it without opening it, but curiosity got the better of me. The message was long, rambling, and full of regret. She apologized, profusely, claiming she'd been blinded by her ambition and insecurities. She said she was miserable, struggling to rebuild her life, and had lost everything that mattered. Then came the kicker. "I know I don't deserve it, but I need your help. Please, if there's any part of you that still cares about me, could you help me find a way back to the country? I just want to start over. I've changed, I promise." I laughed bitterly as I read her words. The audacity. After everything she'd done, after using me, cheating on me, lying to me, she still thought she could manipulate me into saving her. I closed the email and sat there for a while, staring at the screen. Part of me wanted to respond, to tell her exactly what I thought of her and her pathetic attempt at reconciliation. But the other part, the part that had healed, grown, and moved on, knew she wasn't worth the energy. Instead, I forwarded the email to my lawyer, just in case. Then I blocked her. That was the last time I heard from her. In the months that followed, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. The chapter of my life that included her was finally, truly over. She tried to claw her way back in, but I'd shut the door for good. Claire and I continued to build our life together. She understood the weight of what I'd been through, but she never let it define our relationship. With her, there was no manipulation, no ulterior motives, just love, trust, and a partnership built on mutual respect. And as I stood on that balcony one evening, watching the sunset with Ace at my feet and Claire by my side, I realized I'd finally found what I'd been looking for all along.